All right, everyone, welcome in to the Geaux247 podcast. My name's Bryce Koon, and a different face next to me here on the screen. It's not Glenn West. It's not Sunny Ship. It is Cooper Petagna with our 24/7 national recruiting team. Cooper, I know this is an opportunity for you to kind of go back to your home roots, talk a little LSU football. So we're glad you took the time today, man, to hop on and talk about a program that you and I were talking about earlier. Never a dull moment with covering Brian Kelly and LSU.
Never a dull moment. And it seems like, earlier in the week, went to bed, I was joking with Andrew Ivins on our pod. I mean, you wake up and all of a sudden social media is a stir about Brian Kelly's comments. And, our friend Geaux247 doing an incredible job with the one-on-one interview. But I think a lot of that has been taken out of context. So I'm excited to kind of dive into that conversation and hopefully give you, a good 2 cents on kind of what I think about the whole thing.
Yeah, you guys do. You and Andrew do that football recruiting podcasts and encourage people who haven't already. We're going to link that down here below for people to go check out because one of the most recent episodes, you talked just about that. Brian Kelly's interview with Geaux247, and like you said, there with WAFB. Look, I'm going to set it up here for you. It feels like this 10, 15, 20-second clip was, as it is on social media, blown out of proportion. I do understand some of the fan concern, but I also understand where Brian Kelly's coming from. So I know you talked about this yesterday on your show, but provide our listeners and watchers what was some of your biggest takeaways maybe from that comment? And then when you went and watched that interview, did it change or were you able to kind of wrap your head around maybe what BK was trying to get at?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I felt two ways about it. I said on the show it kind of reminded me of my time at Washington when I worked under Chris Peterson because we had a very methodical approach that relied heavily on the pitch of player development. And when you come here, it's really not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult, right? We tried to kind of talk you out of the opportunity to play at the University of Washington. They, when I was there, they had outside of Stanford, the least amount of offers in the FBS. And that was something that Chris Peterson was proud of. Brian Kelly's preached that since he's come over from Notre Dame. He's always talked about he wants to graduate champion. So I'm not surprised about what he said. I think it's a very principled approach in a very lawless land. So in that way, I think what he said can be misperceived as maybe a little bit detached. But I think if you ask the majority of college football coaches at the top of the helm how they felt about this, I would say the majority of those coaches agree with Brian Kelly. That's the way that they would like to run their shop. Now, on the other side of this, you live in a talent acquisition world. The defensive line has plagued LSU now going into year 3 of BK, and you weren't able to get it done in the high school cycle. Sure, you got Dominic McKinley. He's probably going to be a little bit more of a slow burn. BK also talked about 3 guys that they developed. I would argue that Mason Smith didn't get developed. And you can talk about Jacksonville Jaguars taking him in the second round based off the flashes of what they really kind of had to assemble over 3 years. So there's been a lack of continuity between Jamar Cain, Jimmy Lindsey. Now you got Bo Davis. It puts an immense amount of pressure on Bo, not only from a player development standpoint, but from a talent acquisition and a talent identification standpoint. So I understand where he's coming from. I think the other part of this is when you get that number, right, for a Dominic Williams or whoever it is that you're in the market, logically, I understand from a budgetary standpoint, say, you know what, this doesn't fit at all, right? We have a winnable player here, a guy that we think is serviceable, but is asking for an all conference type of number. That's the hard part, and I think a lot of people just want to see LSU swing, get in the box. But even if they paid for this player, let's call it player X, it doesn't mean that it's going to work out in the way that I think a lot of LSU fans think it would work out. So but what do you do? Do you continue to roll forward with what you have, which is inexperienced defensive line with not a ton of depth on the interior? What I would say is I understand the approach, but in terms of how they should have acted last cycle via high school and maybe in the December window as well, it should have been a 5-alarm fire. Now, the thing is, Will Redmond's off to Auburn. Austin Thomas is coming in. You got Preston Tiffany coming in. The lack of continuity, I feel like, in the turnover, not only from a personnel standpoint, but you go from Matt House to Blake Baker. You get a new defensive line coach, like I mentioned, in Bo Davis, whole new defensive staff. it's showing up here. And the other part of that is, we'll talk about the recruiting class in a minute. They have 12 commits. 9 of those guys are on offense, right? So offensively, they've had the luxury of continuity. Sure, Denbrock's out of there, but they promote Sloan. You can see that comfort on that side of the ball. And Brad Davis going into year 3, the continuity that he's been able to build on the offensive line. Same with Cortez Hankton and Joe Sloan. They have not had that luxury on defense. So there's a lot of different variables that come into play, I think, when you just kind of evaluate this, and you don't want to evaluate it in a vacuum. That being said, I kind of compared it to Ohio State, who really struggled, I think, over the last year. Justin Scott out of the state of Illinois. John Walker ends up going to Central Florida. Ohio State's got one of the best hit rates in the country when they had guys on campus. They really had to adjust. They got hit in the mouth. I think LSU's at that point right now where I think this season, defensive line, linebacker depth, overall top-end talent in the front 7, I think here again, going into year 3, that type of, or lack thereof, talent and depth at those position groups is going to continue to rear its head. So this should be something that should have been corrected going into year 3, not going into year 4. That's kind of my prediction on that. And then I would expect LSU, Scott Woodward, the powers that be, to put their heads together and get it corrected. But that being said, as much as Brian Kelly would like to live in a world where, hey, players want to be bought, I completely understand. But that's the world that we live in, right? So you have to take a calculated shot of which players do you actually really want to invest in. And my last thing on this, I'd much rather invest in Dominic McKinley on the front end than maybe have to get jammed up in the spring transfer portal and invest in a player that, you know what, I don't know. It's a 50-50 coin toss whether it works out. Sure, we like the player, but we don't know what the fit's going to look like. We've seen that, plenty of examples, guys like Denver Harris as well, right? So for them, I think it starts with high school recruiting on the defensive line. That's where they got to get right. What they've done offensively on the offensive line is you want to see a reflection of that from Bo Davis. But to put that on his shoulders right now, he's only been there a couple months, wouldn't be fair.
Yeah, and the term brand value is thrown around a lot. And when I think of brand value, a couple of schools that when I was growing up, you saw the logo on the helmet and that attracted kids to go to school there. Early 2000s, I'm thinking USC, I'm thinking Texas, I'm thinking some of those big brands. LSU's obviously in that category, but Cooper, you and Andrew talked about this yesterday. The brand value only takes you so far nowadays. The jerseys, the atmosphere, all these things that as fans we love about the sport and we love about our individual favorite teams. There's another elephant in the room, and it's that NIL, it's that money package. And even the programs that are doing it the best are still having to pay the pretty penny. A lot of people on our message board and across social media kind of feel like it might be just not organized. Do you think that from an NIL perspective, it is an organization issue, and does that directly linked with the lack of continuity when you kind of get to the player personnel? Because I see those player personnel guys as assistants to the CEO of the program, but maybe the term CEO of the program, it can't just be the head coach anymore. He has to have people that can handle with where we have transpired over college football for the past 3, 5, 10 years.
I don't think it's a lack of organization, as you point out, on the NIL standpoint. I think LSU is in places shown that they're very capable from an NIL standpoint. I think Brian Kelly, if you were to use a couple words to describe him as a head coach, I think one of them that would come up would be calculated. Another one that would come up would be measured. This is somebody right now that is struggling, I think, to wrap his head around the inefficiencies of the market. But the marketplace is dictated by teams like Miami, Oregon, Texas A&M, teams with deep wallets that have needs that want to compete immediately. So what you might think is, irrational, that's the market. That's the world that you live in. And not to mention this specific use case, this is one of the most oversaturated positions in all of the portal, not to mention teams that feel like they're 1 or 2 players away that want to be able to go out there, find a starter in the spring transfer portal window or find a depth piece. These guys are going to be elevated financially 2-3x of what they're worth. And I think LSU put their foot down and say, you know what? It's not worth it for us. We'd like to invest maybe somewhere else. Maybe that's in 2025 and beyond. Maybe there's some other places on our team that we feel like we have to address as well. So no, I don't think it's as much inefficiency in terms of the organization, but I do think the lack of continuity in the turnover on staff has hurt LSU. And I think the other thing that you talked about was brand power, brand recognition. Here's the way that I look at it. I think you have to win 2 recruitments. I think to get a hat on the table, you have to win the traditional high school recruitment that happens, really before the start of their senior season. And then when things get tight, you got to win the financial recruitment. So you got to do everything right. You got to show a player development plan. You got to show, hey, why this is the best place for you. And that's what Brian Kelly pointed out. And I think that's where the disconnect is. He's still saying, well, hey, listen, we developed 3 defensive linemen. You want a chance to play on Sunday. You want a chance to hear your name in the first round call. He's got plenty of data points to present. Guess what? So does Kirby Smart, Kalen DeBoer, right? All these guys, the same guys that you're going up against, all else is equal. They have the same pitch as well. So then once you check that box, then it becomes, all right, what can you do for me from a financially incentivized standpoint as well? I think that's going to be the lesson learned for LSU. And, I just think they got too far down the road, maybe thought that they were going to be a little bit more attractive of a player than they actually were. And I think they overestimated their hand. If I had to guess on that, that's kind of where I think LSU is in the market. And I have all the faith in the world that they'll come back to the drawing board, recalibrate, but I don't know if that's going to be able to impact them in 2024. I think it's going to be more big picture, long term.
You talk about big picture, long term. Look, the stats are out there on Brian Kelly, what he does when he's in year 3. The expectations were placed on LSU, and they were placed by Brian Kelly. He's talked about year 3. Does this, and you kind of answered it, move back the goalpost per se? Is there going to have to be some course correction to where you're going to have to essentially coach up the gap in talent and depth that you have there, hope it's passable for 2024, and then really dive into 2025, whether that's portal and a combination of high school recruiting and getting those guys developed?
Yeah, my biggest question marks continue not only to be the lack of top end talent, but the depth on the defensive line. They still have to figure out the best way to utilize Harold Perkins. That's why you bring in Blake Baker. I don't think they're as talented across the board at linebacker, but they have some pieces there. You mentioned Whit Weeks as well as another guy that can maybe step in. And then the secondary is a huge question. What's funny about Brian Kelly in my mind is that some of the biggest, I would say, inconsistencies in LSU football just over the past decade have been the offensive line, have been the tight end position, and those guys have completely changed the tune of those units. Brad Davis, Denbrock when he was here, now you bring in Slade Nagel. The receivers have been true to form, and Frank Wilson has a bevy of talented running backs, and Joe Sloan you got to give a lot of credit to. So in terms of offense, they're humming. Now, what has been their bread and butter, when you think about LSU, you think about a vaunted front seven, and you think about long and very athletic defensive backs and guys that are multi-dimensional, guys that can do a lot of different things. They don't have that. Ashton Stamps was a developmental take out of New Orleans. I think he's going to be a good player. Opposite of him is Toviano, a guy that we kind of viewed as more than likely was going to slide into a nickel role, could eventually be a safety. They don't have those guys. They have good players. They have serviceable to above average good players. They don't have that elite guy or two in the secondary, and especially on the defensive line, they don't have that. So that's been my biggest question mark. And I love Bo Davis. I think he's one of the best defensive line coaches in all the country. But in terms of the recruiter, Bo Davis, I think there's some things there where you have to be self-aware enough if you're Brian Kelly, Blake Baker, Austin Thomas. Hey, we got to help this guy out, right? And that's where NIL has really got to be focused. It's got to be focused on the first level, and it's got to be focused on the third level. And there has been nothing that they have done, in my opinion, this offseason that makes me think, outside of bringing over Blake Baker and a new staff, which you should take that into consideration. But from a pure talent standpoint, how much better is this unit going to be? And they're one of the worst in the country. So, it can only go up. But as sheer talent goes, there's nothing there that makes me think like this is going to be a completely different unit in terms of the complexity there.
Yeah, Cooper, I said after the spring game, the confidence meter for me is going to have to really rely on, can this coaching staff, who I do believe is improved what they previously had, can they close the gap enough to, I mean, for lack of better words, take you out of the top, and get you into the top 100, top 80, top 90 as a defensive unit? That's the question. Because for me, when you look at that roster from year to year, personnel really didn't change. I would argue too, Cooper, maybe they put too many eggs in the basket thinking that one of Mekhi Wingo or Mason Smith would come back and help be an anchor of that interior defensive line. Now, Mason Smith, I don't know about what your take is on it, made the right decision. I don't think there's any question about that with the potential. Mekhi Wingo, well, you look at where he was drafted. A lot of LSU fans on our message board have argued maybe that pitch to him should have been stronger. Could he have known Bo Davis was going to be the guy when he made his NFL draft? All of that's water under the bridge under this point. And like we've alluded to multiple times throughout the shows, we look at this 2025 class. Cooper, I mean, it's exciting. It's easy to get excited. Bryce Underwood, Decoria Moore, Harlem Berry, Devin Harper. And you just go down this list. You get to Jabari Antoine, he's the first defender, and then you have to continue to scroll. You have Charles Ross, who I like in terms of speed. Keelan Moses, a guy that literally plays in the shadows of LSU's football facility over there at ULAB. They've got to do more work here. And I know it's a numbers game. I know you have to have roster management across the board. What is the tone that this staff has to go out and say, hey, we can't swing and miss on some of our big targets? A guy like DJ Pickett comes into mind on the back end of that defense. A lot of other names, across the board that they had on campus multiple times throughout the spring and for the spring game. What are you getting a sense of, hey, this offensive class is taking shape. We got to turn up the heat as summer rolls in and we get some of these OVs.
Well, I said it earlier in the show. From an offensive standpoint, you can see the continuity at work. I mean, they seem to continue from a roster management standpoint, at least on the high school side. And it's not like they're not attentive of this. I know people inside that building, they're working their tail off, but they continue to accentuate positional strengths. They continue to get better on the offensive line, and that's one of the deepest and most talented rooms in their program. Receiver, they continue to bring in different guys that are pretty exciting, that complement each other well. Obviously, the quarterback position with the number one player in the country and Bryce Underwood. I would say so far, at least what I've seen defensively, is Blake Baker, I think, just the way that he is recruited, his position group has a pretty good idea that is a unit that needs to continue to improve just from a talent and overall athleticism standpoint. And Charles Ross is one of those guys, kind of reminds me a little bit of Damone Clark. The profile is insane, and obviously a guy that's run really well. But just in terms of he needs reps, continue to get the feel of the position. Keelan Moses, on the other hand, is a guy that plays the position exceptionally well, but is not as traitsy maybe as a guy as Charles Ross. So, I think the other thing about this is, they brought Corey Raymond in to be the guy that would go out there and acquire top end talent. And you can say what you want about Corey Raymond in terms of player development and maybe lack thereof in some cases, but in terms of talent acquisition, that's never been questioned, right? And what he's been able to do. So I think there's a lot of confidence in terms of what they've been able to establish, not only at the second and third level, but yeah, I mean, there is a onus, and I think there's got to be an onus from the top down for Brian Kelly. Like, if I'm him, listen, everybody wants to coach. He's got one of the best staffs in the country, in my opinion, top to bottom. He's done a tremendous job there, especially after what they've done this offseason on the defensive side of the ball. His investment as a head coach has to be, how do we address the point of attack defensively? How do we get there to where we feel like we are one of the strongest and deepest units in the country? And then how do we continue to add top-end talent in the secondary? Because it has not been the same. He talks about meeting a standard. They have fell short of that standard now for about 2.5 years. And that is something that is very, very disappointing. And now how they have completely reversed roles of maybe taking the weakness of the program in the past and making that a strength, the other shoe has dropped on the defensive side of the ball. And what has used to be a strength is now a weakness. So they got to get that right. And I think, part of that is you're paying Blake Baker $2+ million. That's part of his job too, his talent acquisition. He did a tremendous job of that at Missouri. That's the one thing that I think makes me feel a little bit better about the big picture long term, is that, hey, you got a guy that gets it, and he's been there in Louisiana, and you got guys that have been there in Louisiana and have a pretty good feel for this. I mean, all of these guys, Bo Davis has been at LSU, Corey Raymond's been at LSU, Blake Baker's been at LSU, Kevin Peoples been down at, I think, at Tulane. These guys get it. They know the state,
Yeah.
right? So they've done a tremendous job in Louisiana, but that combination of talent ID and then everything we talked about from an organizational standpoint from the NIL, it's time to put it to use, and that's where they got to do it. I think the time for being conservative has long passed. It's time to go all in, because in my opinion, offensively, they're ready to go in 1 year of high school and transfer portal diligent recruiting with the right investment can really kind of put them over the top from going from a 12-team playoff contender to a team that can compete for a national championship.
So, Cooper, as we kind of round it out here, look, it's no secret Louisiana has some great talent. We were looking earlier at the 2025 class. You kind of look at the 2026 grouping and the talent that's in this state. Wanted to kind of get this from you, because on our message board with the fans of LSU, there's a sense of, hey, we want to keep that talent home, the connections, the bonds that are built, and what it means to play for your in-state school. For LSU fans, they feel like it matters a little bit more. Wanted to get your opinion on how do you balance this if you're Brian Kelly? Hey, there is great talent here, but we need to be on a national search. They've hit with a guy like Bryce Underwood so far. How do you continue that trend while not falling victim to let's build a fence around the state and win with what we have here?
Well, that's a great question, and one that I think is not asked enough, quite honestly. I think that was always the most difficult part of running a personnel department, is the balance of in-state talent. And I think the hard part, maybe the issues that our industry causes sometimes with the rankings, is that public perception is very real. It's something that each coach has to balance. Mario Cristobal had to balance it when we're at Oregon. Chris Peterson had to balance it when we're at Washington. And just because a player is ranked at a certain level, and I kind of talked about this earlier in the show, the job of our industry is project players in terms of their NFL projection, what we ultimately believe is their Sunday potential. It's not the case for LSU or the other 129 FBS teams out there. So they have to balance what is the right fit, and they also have to balance that conversation of in-state talent and saying, hey, X player is ranked here. We need to understand that we're going to take it on the chin if we don't take this player. So it's difficult. I would say the plus side to taking players from the state of Louisiana and the right players is that, you have guys like Ashton Stamps versus a guy like Jeremiah Hughes. Ashton Stamps from New Orleans and the Rummel High School, and you got Ashton Stamps Jeremiah Hughes from Bishop Gorman in Las Vegas. That adversity that most freshmen will experience early on in their career, it helps to have that support system close to home, people that have experience not only with the state and the region, but the program and the university itself. So I think in the transfer portal era, you take that into consideration, having program players, guys like the youngest Bordelon, right? A guy that can play multiple spots on the offensive line. Does he project as a multi-year starter? Sure, maybe he can break through that barrier, but this is a guy that's going to give you a lot of depth that is going to be around. And think about that. I mean, how much that costs you, right? We just spent the first half of the show talking about, all right, what's the price point going to be for finding a guy that can get us out of the game on the offense or defensive side of the line of scrimmage. You'd much rather develop those guys in-house that have a great sense of pride for playing for LSU in the state of Louisiana. So when you have a fruitful state like Louisiana that yields a lot of collegiate talent, doesn't mean that all these guys are going to go on to play on Sunday. It is important that you get the most out of that, especially when there's no other school in state that you have to compete with. And that's a really big deal. And you've seen LSU in the transfer portal really target guys from the state of Louisiana or have ties to LSU. And that's not a coincidence, right? There's a sense of pride and there's a sense of gravity that comes with that brand recognition that we talked about earlier. So there is some strategic value in recruiting the state. That being said, if you're not careful, you can overdo it just because you're trying to win the headlines and you're trying to say, well, guess what? We had 9 of the top players in the state of Louisiana. It doesn't mean anything if you don't accomplish your goals on the field. Nobody's going to look at Brian Kelly and say, you know what, we won 9 games this year. But guess what? For the last 2 years, he's signed 9 of the top 10 players. Nobody cares about that. Trust your process, trust your board, do what you need to do, get organized, stay ahead of the sticks. What I mean, early identification. And if you do that, then it's going to yield the results that you want on the field as well.
Cooper, man, we appreciate the time. Obviously, I know that a little near and dear to your heart to talk about your alma mater. So, man, we're going to have to get you on throughout the summer and maybe as some of these official visits really start to kick up with some of the latest intel. But hey, to let people know, because I know obviously we have some diehard LSU fans watching this, but you and Andrew Ivins have a great podcast if they want to lean into. I know you talk about LSU and other programs as well, and some of the top prospects that the Tigers and many other programs are on. Go ahead and give a plug for that where they can find all that.
Yeah, it's every Tuesday and Wednesday at noon Eastern time on the 247 Sports YouTube channel. It also streams on X through the 247 Sports account as well. So if you have any questions, you want to come by, you want to get in the nitty gritty. I know you and I have very long-winded answers. That's typically how I go. But nitty gritty, roster management, what's happening in college football, how that impacts your favorite program, in this case, LSU. It's kind of the stuff that we're talking about, especially trying to get ahead as much as possible with 2026s. And, just talk about current events and recruiting in all the college football landscape. So, and Bryce, I got to say to you, man, I appreciate you having me on. You're doing a fantastic job. And you guys listening, make sure to follow Bryce. I know he's working his tail off to earn your trust. So please make sure to follow him. He's doing a great job for us.
Appreciate that, Cooper. Thanks so much. Whether you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, give your comments down below, and what you think about all the topics we discussed here today, whether it's from Brian Kelly's comments to recruiting and kind of that balance between in-state and national recruiting as well. He's Cooper. My name's Bryce Koon. We appreciate you tuning in. Next time, we'll catch you here on the Go247 podcast.